Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we want to get to something that's certainly near and dear to us. I think about our conversation with Peter Atwater over at William & Mary, the K-shaped recovery. We talk about records that we've seen in the market, gains for a lot of Americans, and yet that's not the case for everyone. The gap between also, and this is kind of an extreme measure, how much execs make versus how much those on the front line of the companies make is something we talk about a lot. Check this out. According to the Economic Policy Institute, CEO compensation rose by more than 1,000% between 1978 and 2023, while the typical workers' compensation, Tim, rose only about 24%.
Here's another way to look at that gap. Last year, CEOs made 290 times as much as the typical worker. This is coming from the Economic Policy Institute. Back in 1965, it was only 21 times as much as the typical worker. So it may be surprising to you, not to our next guest, who says we need to, quote, pay the people. John Driscoll is the former CEO at CareCentrix. It was bought by Walgreens Boots Alliance more than 2 years ago. He's currently senior advisor at Walgreens Boots Alliance. He's had several senior executive positions at a variety of healthcare companies. He's also a member of Patriotic Millionaires, which calls itself a collection of wealthy Americans fighting against the destabilizing concentration of wealth and power in the United States.
I have to tell you, we have about an hour's worth of questions that we want to talk to you about, just because there's so much going on in healthcare, as you know, right now. But let's talk wages and the gaps and how we fix this. I mentioned Peter Atwater, the K-shaped recovery. Some people are doing really well. There's a lot of Americans who are not, and whether that plays out in politics and so many different aspects of our society, why is it that we continue to see people who don't make a living wage?
Well, Carol, I think we've lost the string. I'm no longer working at Walgreens and focusing on healthcare. I'm really focusing on making the case that it's good for business and it's good for America if we can get to a living wage. We lost the string a while ago between the 1930s and 1980. Median productivity in the United States went up by about 97%, and the median wages went up by about 90%. Mm-hmm. Since 1980 to today, productivity's gone up another 90%, but median wages have only gone up by 9%.
That's a gap.
It's inconceivable that we should sort of push working class folks farther and farther away from being able to take part in this great capitalist adventure that's working for so many of us. But there's 40 million people in America who aren't earning a living wage.
Do you think the incentives are misaligned? Because if we think about, and you've been part of publicly traded companies before, what do investors care about? They care about the top line, and they care about the bottom line.
We never talk about, okay, so they'll,
wages, how much?
Yeah, how much did, the people on the front lines make?
You know what they care? They care about automation and increasing margins.
Yeah.
But I think, though, that you're starting to see things change. At my own
we
company...
We thought this 2018 with the Economic Roundtable, and it's only gotten worse.
I think that first of all, the trend's been horrible for the last 30 years, as I just pointed out. But at my own company, when we froze executive salaries and doubled minimum wage 12 years ago, retention went up, engagement went up, but productivity also went up by about 30%. And you're starting to see some of the most successful companies in America, Bank of America, JP Morgan, also raise their wages to a living wage. They did it as part of that business roundtable commitment, but what they found is that it lowered the number of people who were leaving their jobs, because people who are working in minimum wage jobs are often working 2 jobs. They're not as engaged. They found that productivity went up. What they invested in kind of if you want a fairer social contract, they found they had a more successful and profitable business. I think the most important thing is we get the story out that it is a productivity gain and a win for the companies, and also that I don't think that capitalism can easily be sustained if the bottom third of the workforce isn't really part of if the company wins, you win.
So why don't we do it then? You lay out a really good premise, an argument. Why isn't it that more companies don't do that?
Well, that's what I am focused right now, Carol, on selling that story and telling that story. Because even for the executives that have done it, they are surprised at how it increases how long folks stay at jobs. It increases their productivity. But that's not a story that many people have told, and they certainly haven't told it with very specific examples. Our ability to pay claims grew by 30%. people stayed at our company for longer. We had fewer people quietly quitting or quitting very quickly. And so I think it's selling and telling that story. I also think that we're getting the message in a lot of different ways. I think the reason why we have so much rancor, anger, and discontentment in working class voters of all races and backgrounds is they're not really feeling like they're part of business, of an America that works, where business is clearly working and being successful.
Because, John, one of the things Tim and I have talked about a lot, and you write about the Restaurant Association and the restaurant industry, that I feel like, first of all, we feel like there's a tip jar everywhere. And to me, it just says we're not paying workers enough.
Correct.
And why aren't companies paying workers? Why do I would rather pay more for an item and just ensure that these workers are getting paid. I think about the restaurant industry that, right, they expect that they're going to be tips. Like, how do we kind of rework that?
Well, I think we have to actually tell the story, sell the story, and then organize. But there are plenty of examples. Danny Meyer has been a leader in and a supporter of the movement that we're working on, which is to eliminate kind of the tipped minimum wage,
right,
which is still at $3.25.
It's unbelievable.
And you start thinking of we're not talking about Danielle. We're talking about most people are working at Denny's, and when you increase the minimum wage and you get to a fair wage. California raised the fast food minimum wage to $20 an hour. I thought it was an odd thing to do, but there was a lot of complaints that would harm the industry. There's thousands more fast food jobs now.
Why did you think it was an odd thing to do?
Well, I think it was odd to just bring it up for one category.
Right.
For me, the most important thing is to eliminate tip minimum wage across the board and get to a living wage. Again, you've got 40 million people where they're working full-time jobs and one job doesn't afford them enough to live independently and pay their bills.
What do you think of the most wealthy people in the world right now? Someone like Elon Musk, for example, whose fortune has increased by roughly $200 billion just since the election. Certainly took a haircut today with the sell-off in Tesla. What do you make of the concentration of wealth at the very top?
Well, I think one of the things that we actually got me excited about Patriotic Millionaires is that I was deeply offended by the notion of the reduction of taxes on the most wealthy and the reduction of the estate tax, because I think the threat of intergenerational oligarchic wealth of massive scale, intentionally or unintentionally distorting the politics of the moment, is a real challenge. And that was 20 years ago when I started working with Patriotic Millionaires. But I don't think the biggest problem we have is the massive accumulation at the top, because part of that's related to technology. It's the fact that we cut off the bottom third of workers in America, and that's not going to be good for the economy. If more and more people feel like they're not part of the American dream, we're the only country that dream is associated with the country. Our country is held together by this notion that we're in it together. If the bottom third of America does, from a wages and wealth perspective, doesn't feel like they're part of it, I worry about democracy. I think there are plenty of things you could do in tax policy to certainly make sure that, as Warren Buffett says, he isn't paying a lower percentage of taxes than his assistant. I think we should have a fair inheritance tax so we don't have these massive concentrations of wealth. But the urgent problem of today is to pay people who are working hard, leaning in, people who are at the bottom third of the wage scale, who are really, running up a down escalator of costs, particularly at a time of inflation.
So how do we get executives to start thinking about it? We have many conversations with CEOs, and we often do hear about having to pay up for talent, but I'm assuming they mean executives and folks kind of higher up in their company, and not necessarily everyone. How do we get them to think about that all across all of the workers that they pay for?
Well, I don't know how we convince them, but the voters are already there. The raising the minimum wage to a higher level has won in almost. I think it's 19 out of 20 states that's been put on the ballot. In the last election cycle, raising the minimum wage won by 6 points in Missouri. It won easily in Alaska. Those are both Trump plus 10 or 20 states. And the Republican attempt to reduce the raising the tip minimum wage actually was defeated at the ballot box in Arizona. So the voters are already there. I think the only way we're going to get there today is politically, because if you have to convince one executive at a time, we'll be here forever.
So through voters?
We have to put it on the ballot. We have to get it through Congress. And I think what's remarkable to me is the Republican voters are already there.
Yeah.
Is it a zero-sum game? Like, is it if to pay workers more, do executives have to earn less?
Not at all. I mean, there is. I mean, the most recent example of raising fast food minimum wage and creating more fast food jobs is the example of the last couple of years. But when the Restaurant Association, as we talk about in the book, actually polled its members, not its lobbyists in D.C., they found that many of them actually wanted to increase those wages. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist who studied what happened when New York raised its wages in hospitality and Pennsylvania didn't. And what they found is that the New York businesses actually grew faster, which means those business owners made more money even though the wages that they had to pay were higher.
Well, do you think raising minimum wage in one sector, like restaurants, does raise minimum wage across other sectors too? You don't think so? So you don't think, like, if you're getting paid $20 an hour to work at McDonald's, then the warehouse owner has to raise their wages to that, or else their employees are going to go work at McDonald's instead?
I mean, is the burger going to go up, or the fries going to go up?
Well, the reality is the percentage of labor that goes into the Big Mac is actually pretty trivial. It would probably, to pay a living wage at McDonald's, it would probably go up by 4 to 5 cents per burger. So I think it's
not much.
It's de minimis.
I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate here.
No, absolutely. And where I was going with is we're moving too slowly. It's time to actually change the laws, change the rules, and make sure that everybody at the bottom end of the pay scale is paid a living wage. And that's true for folks. We've got to eliminate the tip minimum wage. I would eliminate the discount for disabled workers. We have to get to the point where all executives who believe in the dignity of work start paying wages that are equivalent to dignified pay.
We have this terminal function on the Bloomberg terminal where we can look up executive compensation. So forgive me for being fresh, but you are part of a group that does argue that many people should be getting paid more and executives sometimes should be getting paid less. In 2023, your total compensation was over $11 million. Was that too much? Were you paid too much?
I have been the beneficiary of a capitalist system that overpays the top and isn't paying enough at the bottom. But I am absolutely certain, that we could get to a living wage level, and it would make no big dent on the comp at the top. But let me also say that as a patriotic millionaire, I am on the record as saying I think we should increase taxes on people like me and increase the estate tax for all of us.
How high should they be? Because if you go back in history, I mean, the top marginal tax rate would shock, 50, 60 years ago, would shock people today.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like
insanely high.
Yeah.
It was insanely high.
Let's start by not extending the tax cuts that Trump put in place when he was in office. Let's start by getting to a level that we were paying during the Clinton administration, which was one of the greatest periods of prosperity, and we were actually paying down the debt. We have a $1.7 trillion deficit this year. It is not going to be news to anyone who can do math that all of us are going to be paying taxes. And I think it should be very clear that people like me should be paying more taxes than most.
Yeah, but we've been hearing this for a couple of years. I mean, I remember being out at Milken a few years ago and people saying, yep, it's time for us to pay more taxes, really wealthy individuals. And yet here we are. One thing I want to ask you, because we're running out of time, is that if we believe in a free market, I'm looking at your book about some of the myths that are out there, that if we pay people a living wage, some of the myths that you kind of address. And one is, this isn't an issue for the government because the free market will naturally take care of it. We saw wages go up during the pandemic and out of it because there was a shortage of workers. And so supply, demand, free market, it was at work. But I don't know that will continue. Will the free market kind of help bring this about?
Well, I think if you look at where wages are right now, even during the pandemic, while there was a slight bump in wages at the bottom, costs went up at twice the rate that wages went up.
Right.
And so, no, the free market has failed. And by the way, it worked when we actually had a minimum wage that was closer to reflecting a living wage, which drove the greatest period of economic success the world has ever seen between the 40s and the 80s. We unhooked the bottom third of the workforce at that point, and I think we've got a pretty angry, unhappy electorate and a lot of people living in near poverty, and that's just not fair.
We just had a conversation with, what was it, the CEO of Feeding America?
Feeding America, yeah.
And just talked about, the people who just don't have enough food on their table.
Yeah,
can't
food
afford to
insecurity
put
in this country.
Food insecurity.
It's just mind-boggling.
Just incredible, the percentages. And so
One,
we see
one out of 3 or 4 kids, 1 out of 5 households. That is unacceptable. And by the way, paying a living wage is not going to cost capitalism. It's actually going to improve our markets and business environment.
30 seconds is a living wage the same in every state, in every city? It's got to be depending on the locale.
No, I think that the feds should set a living wage at the national median.
Okay.
And then you can vary it up or down based on what the true cost. The costs in LA and New York are very different than the costs in Jackson, Mississippi, or West Texas. You have to vary it. But the minimum is so low right now as to be insulting to workers.
I feel like you're preaching to the choir. John Driscoll, come back soon. This was an important conversation. Of course, former CEO of CareCentrix, his new book, Pay the People, Why Fair Pay is Good for Business and Great for America.